Welcome back for reflections on so-called Christian nationalism. How many of you have heard this term Christian nationalism before? I'll tell you what I think of when I hear the term, and I don't think it's what people mean, but I spent 6 years in seminary and then 11 years doing a PhD in a discipline that I was not teaching, which is not normal. Normally you get your PhD and you teach. I did it the other way around. I taught for 15 years while I was getting a PhD in something I wasn't teaching. I taught philosophy and religion and ethics and logic, which is supposed to be a part of philosophy. But 11 years it took me to get public law and American politics. My point is, having spent 6 years in seminary as my background in politics, the way certain words hit me when people talk might be different than my colleagues. Of course, I'm a Republican, so I'm already different. But this term Christian nationalism gets thrown around. And here it is, December 7th, in the year of our Lord 2024. Guess what? It's Christmas time. In the Anglican tradition and the Christian tradition, it's Christmas time. So this time of year, usually around Thanksgiving, I start thinking about a little bit more deeply about the relationship that Christianity has had on the United States. Let me just plug an episode that TRP did in 2022 with Daniel Dreisbach. Fantastic episode on his wonderful book, Oxford University Press, called Reading the Bible with the Founding Fathers. And that book I highly recommend. It's Saturday morning here in California. It's still dark out. It's it's before 7 in the morning. It's 6:45. And I'm just having my I'm having my second cup of coffee here. So I believe I'm ready to do this, okay? Some of you guys know I'm on staff at a church here. Been on staff for several years. I'm on the preaching rotation, and I've preached on this past year, this topic of so-called Christian nationalism. That's not typically how I approach it when I'm preaching, but in the Anglican tradition, they're used to like 20-minute sermons. I went for an hour. I kept them for an hour, and I barely scratched the surface of this, okay? That's not what I'm going to do today. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to break it up into sections. And I'm going to springboard on a topic that we covered this past week, which was the pardon power, okay? I'm going to come at this obliquely. And if you feel like you're drinking from a fire hydrant, okay, well, I'm going to try to not have you feel like you're taking a drink of water from a fire hydrant, but this does require an attention span. I'm just going to lay that out there, that if you don't have an attention span, you're going to have very minimal benefit from this. You will benefit, but you'll get the full benefit if you give yourself some patience, because this is a little bit it's deep, it's rich. The pardon power. Remember we covered that a couple days ago? Biden pardoned his son, and we read from Federalist 74, Hamilton. And I'm just going to mention something that Hamilton said that I did not say at the time. And Hamilton calls this pardon power, the power of the president in Article 2 of the Constitution. He calls it the mercy of the government. The mercy of the government. I want to invite you to reflect on the following question. Why would the government have mercy ever? Okay? You don't have to answer it, but Hamilton calls the pardon power the mercy of the government. That's on page 446 of the Federalist Papers Signet Classic Edition, with introduction and notes by Charles R. Kessler, which I think is the best version of the Constitution and the Federalist Papers, because you look at the Constitution, and the Constitution has the page numbers you can go to, which are very handy for going right to where they talk about the pardon power. Plus, Kessler was my professor when I took the Federalist Papers at the PhD level, and he's quite good. But it's called the mercy of the government. Okay, I'm just gonna invite you to think about it the following way. Christianity is in the background. It's in the room, but it's not saying anything. It has a presence in the room. That's how I think of the Christian influence on the country. I mean, just think about it. The pardon power. We take it for granted that there should be a pardon power. Alexander Hamilton just takes it for granted that there should be a pardon power. You know, he says that the way he says it, we covered this last time, a couple days ago. But he says that the humanity and good policy conspire to dictate that the benign prerogative of pardoning should be as little as possible fettered or embarrassed. Meaning, you don't want to hyper-legislate and regulate the pardon power. You don't want to regulate it at all. Just let it exist, and let it one guy make the decision, and it's not reviewable by any court. It just exists. I can't think of another power besides maybe receiving ambassadors and signing vetoes or something like that the president has that is so unfettered. And it's mercy. Now that's very interesting. Why would mercy get such a blank check in any government? And by the way, in most governments, do they have this in North Korea? There's a pardon power, but it's just based in corruption purely, right? It's based not in anything Christian at all. In fact, I wouldn't even say it's really about mercy. I mean, it's just about I don't even understand what mercy is in an atheistic worldview, to be honest with you. I'm suggesting this. I'm not saying this is a knockdown, drag out argument. I'm suggesting this is a way of looking at the influence of Christianity on the United States, and you have to be aware of the sources, at least a little bit, to even understand what I'm talking about. Let me give you some more examples of things that can be explained, I think, best explained with Christianity just in the background, just kind of hovering. And some of this comes from Daniel Dreisbach, who was on the podcast 2 years ago that I just mentioned, his book, Reading the Bible with the Founding Fathers. In Article 2, which creates the presidency, you have the oath of office. And it's called this. It's called the oath or affirmation. That's a very interesting way of saying it. An oath or affirmation. God's not mentioned, but an oath. The whole idea of an oath. That's a very ancient thing. It could be pagan too. People might swear to Zeus or, some fake god, right? But in the Christian tradition, you swear to God, right? And when I say Christian tradition, I'm including the Jewish tradition. And at the time of the New Testament, this is not the New Testament. I'm pointing to a dictionary right now that I'm going to get to in a second. But this is the New Testament. In the time of the New Testament, my bookmark is a knife. Second Amendment biblical scholars here. At the time of the New Testament, Jesus talks about the Jewish tradition of making an oath and, adding all these words to it to make it an extra oath, and Jesus says, just cut that out. Just affirm yes or no. Make your yes be yes, make your no be no. Just affirm yes or no. So that's why, if you know that distinction, oaths and affirmations are in the Bible. They're both part of the biblical tradition. And if you're reading this and you see oath or affirmation, you understand that dispute in the Bible is reflected right there in the Constitution. Okay, that's one example. Here's another example, the veto power. And I believe the veto power is actually in the section on Congress. It's the only presidential power that's in the section on Congress, which is in Article 1. And it mentions Sunday as a day that doesn't count in the countdown for the veto. And so, there's these little things. Why is Sunday mentioned as a day off? Well, if you're in the Christian tradition, you know exactly why Sunday is mentioned as a day off. Because Christianity historically changed the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. Now, I know Seventh-day Adventists disagree with that, and there are Christian traditions that disagree with that, and there's Jewish traditions, that are frankly not really Jewish. They're just ethnically Jewish that don't recognize a Sabbath at all. But by and large, Christianity did change the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. That's why it's in there. And if you don't know anything about the Christian tradition, you might be totally puzzled by why that would be. I'll give you one more. There's a lot of these, and they're very subtle. In Article 7 of the Constitution, right before George Washington signs it, this is very subtle, okay? But I'm saying, it's in the background. It's just hanging out in the background. So it says, done in convention by the unanimous consent of the states present, the 17th day of September, in the year of our Lord. And you're reading this, and it's about creating the government, right? And then all of a sudden he uses this word Lord, and it's capitalized. Hold on a second. I thought this was a government of the people by the people, as Lincoln mentions later. What is this Lord? What are you talking about, Lord? If I was an alien coming down from outer space, and I heard this guy say the word Lord, And this is kind of an important part of this because this is when it was done. You know, this isn't like a throwaway line here. He's saying this is when this takes effect. This is when it's done. When you're signing a document, the date is one of the most important things. Not just what it says, but when it says. And how do you describe when? In the year of our Lord. And then he gives a certain number, 1787, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 12th. He gives 2 dates. One from independence. Doesn't reference any king, nothing like that. And then he references a king, but not the King of England. The king of the world, apparently. And who's the word Lord refer to? True or false, is Jesus referred to in the Constitution? True. that refers to Jesus. Okay, it's in there in the background. Now you might say, it's just how they talked. Exactly my point. Exactly my point. That's how Christians talk. Okay. Now, Matthew. I'm in Matthew. This is a Greek interlinear Bible. And I want to make some inroads here on this issue of so-called Christian nationalism. That's not how I refer to it. I refer to it as Christianity as ethnicity. Okay, that's the angle I'm taking. And I think Matthew 1:21 is a good place to start here in the Christmas season. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. She will bear a son, and you will name him Jesus, for he will save his people from his sins. This is the angel talking to Joseph. Now I'm going to drill down on the word his people. Okay? His people. And I'm going to use a Greek dictionary to give you a little bit of background on this term. His people, laos. Let me make sure I have it pulled up here, because there's 2 words and they're synonymous. Laos, and it means. Let me give you the a little bit from this book here. Setting the New Testament aside here. His people. In Homer, it just means a bunch of men. It could be a military, an army. Later, this term disappeared. It occurs in the Old Testament, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, Hebrew. The plural always means nations. Okay? Laos often means the people, in contrast to the ruler or ruling class. But it does have a tribal or nation meaning there. His people. So there's a people of God. There's a people of God. The characteristic here mentioned is they are saved from their sins. Jesus saves them from their sins. The people of God are people that are saved from their sins by Jesus. This is why the Christian tradition and Christmas is so important. Now, there's another word. Let me go to the end of Matthew. So that's the beginning of Matthew. Here, let's go to the end of Matthew. This is a famous quotation. You probably know it. Matthew 28. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. And then that's the end of Matthew. That's it. Matthew begins with genealogy and this instruction from the angel. You're supposed to name him. This is why. He's going to save his people from the sins. The word people typically means nation or tribe. Here we have the word nation again, but it's a different Greek word. It's the word ethnos. That's the word we get our word ethnicity from. And it's also translated people. This is the source I'm using here. It's called New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology. And as you can see, it's G through P, and I'm looking at people here. Ethnos. Laos in early Matthew, here, people. It's right here, same people. It's under people here. Ethnos here. And it says custom, habit. It means, well, it's derived from ethos, which means custom or habit. But ethnos, as opposed to ethos, means a group which is held together by customs, a clan, a crowd, a company of people. It means, in translating Hebrew, it translates goy, which is a word for, usually translated Gentile. It could be translated pagan or heathen. Goyim is the plural. But what it really means, though, when you say Gentile, I mean, you have to kind of even translate what Gentile means, right? When you say the word Gentile, what do you mean? You mean an ethnicity that's not Jewish. That's what you mean. But how many ethnicities fit that? Well, all of the other ethnicities fit that, right? So it really means ethnicities, right? And in Greek, that's actually the word ethnos. Okay. Now in Matthew here, it's panta ta ethne, which is all the nations. It's, for you nerds here, you're going to appreciate this. It's the accusative case. It's direct object. It's plural, and it's gender neutral there. Ethnos in the dictionary is, in that form, it's the masculine nominative. That's just how dictionaries work in Greek. I'm going to just get one more Greek dictionary here. This is the Greek-English Lexicon of the New Testament and Other Early Christian Literature, 3rd edition, Frederick Denker, okay, based on Walter Bowers. So this is like hardcore German, higher critical stuff. And I luckily still have this on ethnos. A body of persons united by kinship, culture, and common traditions. In other words, nation, people. Okay. I think that's all I'm going to use right there. So I'm trying to get you to reflect on the word people or nation. So when you talk about Christian nationalism, people typically don't drill down into these details here. And I don't use the term Christian nationalism. I talk in terms of Christianity as ethnicity, because the Bible presents Christianity as an ethnicity, a new ethnicity. It's not Judaism. It's a people. Now, a body of persons united by kinship, culture, common traditions. Think about what people are. This stuff is passed down from the older generation to the younger generation. That's how it works. People, like other things, start out young and they get old. But they don't last very long. People don't last long at all. So unless this stuff is passed down to the new people, the kids, it's not going to last. And then they have to pass it down. When that happens for a long period of time, you have a people, an ethnicity. Now you think of geographical locations as sometimes a bookmarker for a people, an ethnicity. What do I mean? I'm talking about China. I'm talking about Japan as two examples. When you think of Japan, you think of the Japanese people, right? It's almost like the geography is the same thing as the ethnicity in that case. Sometimes it's a language. You think of the language and then you think of the people, the ethnicity. Well, that's how it is in the Old Testament. And like, for example, in Exodus 21, refers to having a Hebrew servant. Oh, the term is used as Hebrew. That's a language. But the language stands for the ethnicity, the people that speak that language. And the same with Chinese and Japanese. You think of studying Chinese, well, you're studying the language of people who speak that language, and they're Chinese. You call the people the same thing as the language. But in Christianity, what's the language? What's the geography? That's what makes it a little bit hard to grasp. And when people say Christian nationalism, that's the first hurdle you got to get to. Is okay. Well, first of all, what's the language, and secondly, what's the geography? Christianity is spoken about as a people, but the only geography that is mentioned is a New Jerusalem, which hasn't happened yet. And in terms of a language, I mean, I think the closest you could get would be the Word of God. And that's playing a little bit fast and loose with what I mean by language. Let me drill back into this definition again of ethnos. A body of persons united by kinship, culture, common traditions, passed down from older to younger. And that means that somebody is doing the passing down. That means there's leadership. There's somebody in charge. We don't typically think of ethnicity this way, but there's always somebody in charge. And maybe you don't know their name, but the elders are in charge or whatever. Who's in charge of China? Well, it's not, maybe just not one person. It's the elders. It could be one person at the top. Who's in charge of English? Well, in that case, it would be, there was a monarchy developed over time. See Winston Churchill's History of the English-Speaking People. That's not a that's not an easy story to follow. It's not like all of a sudden there was a king one day. It's not simple. It's not a simple story. My point is that there's always somebody in charge at some point, and keeping track of that might be a little bit complicated. But in this case of Christianity as ethnicity, who's in charge? God. God is in charge. This is the people of God. In the human sense, Jesus is in charge. Jesus is our chief, our tribal leader, our king. In the Old Testament, there were tribes, and they had leaders. Usually the tribe is named after the leader. In the case of Dan, which is one of the tribes, it's named after a guy named Dan. That's why the tribe's called Dan. In the case of the tribes of Israel, there's a further leader, which is Dan's dad. Dad is called Israel, but he was originally called Jacob. And then, of course, these are in the Abrahamic tradition. So, in other words, the genealogy is important in establishing who's in charge and what the ethnicity is and what the characteristic is. In the case of the Old Testament, there's geography and there's land involved. Now, what does this all have to do with the United States? Well, we have a certain number of people that have broad agreement on some basic things, and they get together and they decide as colonists to scrap the British monarch. They're going to keep the language is English. They're going to keep that. They're going to keep the land, but they want to restructure some things, and they still acknowledge Jesus as our Lord, the one that's creating the date system. And there's broad agreement. Sunday is a day off, and there's Christmas, and there's Easter, there's Thanksgiving, which is a new tradition. There's the importance of mercy and the pardon power, for example, and the importance of having oaths or affirmations when you sign contracts or when you sign a document, or when you promise to do something, fulfill your duties in a certain way as president or as a member of Congress. And eventually there's maybe even broad agreement about what to do with people that have been kidnapped from Africa and forced against their will to become slaves, and how to deal with that. And that leads me back to what I wanted to talk about with the pardon power. And I think I'll leave it here. And when I get back to this later, I'm going to talk about the Indians. The Civil War, as you recall, a key part of ending the Civil War was Appomattox Courthouse, when Grant supervised the signing of surrender terms to General Lee. And by the way, it was an American Indian that was the one that was creating those documents. He was a brigadier general for the Union, for the Republicans. Yes, the Republican Party started in 1854, promoted an American Indian to general. So General Lee has been defeated. Slavery as a legal institution is, in military terms, dead. And what does General Grant, who's a Republican, how does he treat the people that are surrendering? Remember, they were just fighting for slavery. And it was a brutal thing for 4 years. Part of the reason it took so long is because there was so much dragging of the feet by the first people that were in charge of the army under Lincoln. Finally, Grant gets in there and kicks a bunch of ass and ends this thing. How is Christianity hovering in the background here? It's a real thing that people had to struggle with in Christian history. Very early on, Christians were wondering, can I serve in the military? Can I get violent? Can I bear arms? What are my duties and responsibilities as a Christian to, in the language of Jeremiah in the Old Testament, seek the welfare of the city? If you're going to seek the welfare of the city and there's injustice in the city, how do you go about that as a Christian? Well, I'm not saying that Grant was a very good, Bible study leader here, but his answer would have been, you get in there and you kick ass and you take names. But at the end of that, he had total victory. And as the total victor, it's a neglected aspect of the Christian nationalism discussion, the role of mercy. The role of mercy in the Republican Party. This was a Republican Party thing. The Republicans had mercy. Should they have had mercy? This was some pretty evil stuff. Well, they did. They did have mercy. General Grant said, you can go home. No prison for you. Just stop fighting. Take your horses. I mean, I don't think he even disarmed them completely. That's a tremendous act of mercy. Now, usually when I hear the term Christian nationalism, ironically, in the current context, this is deeply ironic. I oftentimes, it seems to be kind of mushed in there with some kind of accusation of racism or something like that, or a lack of justice or something like that. But it's rarely couched in terms of mercy going too far. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about here at Christmas season, when President Biden just had a pardon, and he's going to do more pardons. The whole idea of mercy in government. Why would the government ever have mercy on anything? Well, that's the Christian tradition. I mean, how can you not have mercy in the Christian tradition? Now, I say that as a Republican because when I read the history on this, I know what happened when those guys went home. Not everybody, but there was a huge resistance to the Republican Party. And it got violent, and there were thousands of murders and rapes and arsons, acts of terrorism. That was enabled because of this mercy. If this had been Roman justice, if it had been, we're going to wipe you out and replace you with Republicans. The result was that Abraham Lincoln was not protected with arms. I still don't understand that. It's like people that complain about so-called school shootings back in the day. They didn't do a damn thing to protect those kids. Not a damn thing. In fact, they endangered the kids by making it illegal to protect them, by criminalizing self-defense, which is, I think, one of the most evil things you can do. It's what Nazis did. It's what the Soviet Union did. All communists do that. All communists criminalize self-defense. Nazis criminalize self-defense. And the American Democrats did the same damn thing. Okay? All right. Abraham Lincoln was left unprotected, and he was murdered. Immediately, a Democrat vice president from Tennessee took over and began undoing all of that progress. And the way he went about it was by exercising the pardon power and granting leniency and mercy to all of these guys that would eventually become murderers and terrorists in the Ku Klux Klan, which started in Tennessee, his home state. And that went on for a long period, years, and it took until, see, that was 1865. There was another election in 1868, and General Grant won that election as a Republican, and then Grant had to work toward undoing all that. Now remember, I just said Grant had extended mercy in the Appomattox courthouse, as you know, years before. So now he's undoing the mercy that was generated by Andrew Johnson. I'm centering on the issue of mercy in government. And I'm suggesting Christianity's in the background. It's not telling you exactly what the answer is. It's not telling you this is who you should have mercy on in this way, in this way, in this way. Broadly speaking, the issue of mercy, if I could say what the problem is that you need to think about, is when the president has a duty to take care of the laws be faithfully executed, which is a duty, but he also has the power to grant pardons. How the heck do you work those two things out? When you grant a pardon, you're being particular in mercy. But that means that it seems like you're being unfair, because this guy gets off the hook and all these other people get justice. Does that seem like a biblical theme to you? If you're familiar with if you're familiar with the Bible, you should be thinking about biblical stuff right now, because this is a biblical theme. Why do you get off the hook and other people don't? There's even a parable about it. There's a parable from Jesus where there's a guy that gets extra special treatment, and the people that don't get that same special treatment get really pissed off. And like I said, Christianity's in the background. It's not dictating what Abraham Lincoln does. It's not dictating what General Grant does. They're doing the best they can. But I could tell you this, that the Ku Klux Klan started because of Christian nationalism, but it's not the Christian nationalism you're thinking about. It started because there was mercy, and they took advantage of it. The Democrats took advantage of that mercy, and they committed evil. And then Republicans had to go in and crush that without mercy. This is an age-old problem. Just giving you something to think about. Shoot, we have not even scratched the surface of this stuff. God has had mercy on us. We did not deserve it. Mercy, by definition, is not deserved. But somehow God is still just as well. How you work that out is a matter of some curiosity. And I'm hoping to spark your curiosity about this stuff. Apparently, we're left here to do the best we can with what we have. And ask God for help. At the end of the Civil War, toward the end of the Civil War, Lincoln gave one of his last speeches. And it's called his second inaugural address, which was in March of 1865. He was killed in April of 1865. And in Lincoln's second inaugural address, he describes the most significant event in American history, the Civil War, entirely as a Republican, the first Republican president. Brand new party. Of course, it's not new anymore. It's called the Grand Old Party now, GOP. It's old because it started in 1854. The Democratic Party, ironically, is older, 1828-ish. But Abraham Lincoln in the second inaugural address described and interpreted the most important event in American history, the Civil War, entirely in biblical terms. The President of the United States. Entirely in biblical terms. And of the quotations that he uses the mercy quotations. He uses the judgment quotations. But he uses the mercy quotations as the emphasis. He says, and I'm paraphrasing, there's no way I could say it as well as he did, but he says that the North and the South are both guilty of slavery. And now we have to have mercy. We deserve judgment. We deserve all the judgment we get. But we need to have charity. Of course, the Democrats took that and ran and started the Klan and used it as an excuse to commit terrorism. And then we had to fight that. And that was a major job of the Republican Party in the 1800s, was to civilize the Democrats and to get them to stop being such assholes, basically. And that was a long job, and it was a very hard job. And took a long time, took decades. And that job, by the way, is not completely finished. But I think it's, if you want to understand the way I'm coming at this is me, like one of my heroes, Abraham Lincoln, I like to as much as possible immerse myself in these sources and have a Christian understanding of the events and a Christian interpretation of what I'm seeing. and it at least give you that interpretation. It doesn't mean there's not going to be problems later, but I think it's the most accurate way of describing what we have here. And today, I'm going to reiterate the thought I want to leave you with, which is that Christianity is presented as an ethnicity. And an ethnicity, it's a body of persons united by kinship, culture, and common tradition. Sometimes it's called a nation, sometimes it's called a people, sometimes it's called a tribe when it's a smaller unit, sometimes it's called a city. The older have to pass the stuff down to the younger, otherwise it doesn't work. There's no people there. And the same thing I could say about American nation. I think that there is, in a similar sense, maybe exactly the same sense of ethnicity, that there is an American ethnicity. It's not racial. It's not what you look like per se simplified. That's not what it is. It's a body of persons united by kinship, culture, and common tradition. In the Christian tradition, you hear the term brother, sister, mother, whatever. Remember when Jesus says in Matthew 12, he says, "Those who do the will of my Father in heaven, they are my brother, my sister, my mother." He uses the term, he uses the kinship language. And the theme is obedience. Obedience to who? The person in charge of this new ethnicity. Go back to Matthew 28. Go to all of the ethnicities. Make disciples of them. Which means what? Well, baptizing them, you got to grab them. You got to hold them underwater. Baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Teach them to obey all that I have commanded you. That's the language of politics. That's the language of obedience. You're teaching them. You're passing it on. And then they're going to pass it on to their people in their group. So that the ethnicity of Christianity is overlaid over whatever ethnicities are already there. And it's not like they're going to replace those things, but it adds it as a layer, and that layer is supposed to make the ultimate difference in those people's lives, in that nation, in that tradition, in that people group, in that tribe, however you want to describe it. And that's what I think is happening in America, and there's a battle for that in America. Just like it would be anywhere else. Just like it would have been in ancient Rome. There was a battle for it in ancient Rome and the Roman Empire. So, Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas season for you. We're going to kick this Christmas season off with a reflection on Christianity as ethnicity, and I think in the future I'm going to talk about China. I'm going to talk about the Chinese ethnicity. The Chinese ethnicity. We'll discover the pitfalls of describing it that way, and I think I'm going to American Indians. And where I'm headed is, I think one of the major pitfalls in education that I see these days is kids don't know how to talk about ethnicity. They're frightened to death of being a bad person. In my day, back in my day, it was about popularity, but I think I've described that as I think really popularity is just short for being a good person and being acknowledged as a good person. And I see that the young kids are very sensitive about being thought of as bad. And I think adults are too. You just drive through LA and everybody wants to be a good person. But here's the problem. The assumptions about what it is that makes a good person or a bad person are flawed. And they're just merely assumptions. They're not thought through. So this is a problem that compounds itself because the only way you're going to solve the problem of not being well thought out is to think things through. And that means you have to have the permission to think things through. And oftentimes that means dialogue about thinking things through. That's the genius of Socrates and Plato, is that they discovered very helpfully, I think, that dialogue, constructive dialogue in a disciplined way, focused way, is the key in untangling things that are confusing and making progress in understanding the world as it really is. And if you don't do that because you're afraid of what you might say, you say something wrong because a word was redefined 2 years ago, and all the cool kids say you're a bad person now. And it's not like they say it directly, but it's insinuated and it's assumed. What ends up happening is the kids shut down. They lose curiosity. They don't think that they can possibly learn anything. Why? Because they're going to be a bad person as soon as they have the wrong thought, which is totally flawed. It's totally false, but that's in the drinking water here. And a lot of it is this hypersensitivity about anything having to do with anything about ethnicity. And so what ends up happening is there's a tremendous ignorance about it. And the kids are not making any progress. And by the way, it's the same with gender and whatever else people have told you to be sensitive about. What I think would be really helpful is if we have a radical permission to think afresh and to think through these things and uncover what our slogans are and what our assumptions are. And that starts, for me, I have a profound commitment to this process because I'm not scared of someone thinking I'm a bad person. I'm not scared of it. The reason I'm not scared of it is I'm extremely well grounded in this stuff because I've spent a lot of time in the woodshed, and I know people are often wrong about what makes a good person or a bad person. And so I see the popularity contest going on right now, and I'm not intimidated. And you know what? I think actually it can be evil because you're shutting down curiosity with kids. Because you're making them so afraid to say anything in class. And I'll just give you one example, okay? I'll give you one brief example. I use the term American Indian. I never use the word Native American. I notice my kids, my students always say Native American. It's not because they've thought deeply about it and read books, read tons of books. All the books I have refer to American Indians as American Indians. But, so it's not like they've done all this research and that's why it's a considered approach for them. No. They've just, in the limited context that they have where the subject comes up, they notice that that's how you're supposed to talk because of the people that they quickly assume are popular people talk that way. And that's really the only thought that they've ever put into it, the term. So I use the term American Indian on purpose. Because here's why. Because I'm going to assign them reading that uses that term. And I don't want them to read that stuff and then start judging the author based on the usage of that term, and then they can't think it. They can't think anything else. They've already stopped thinking because they assume they're better than the author. So that all of a sudden they can't learn anything from the past because they're so used to redefining everything every 2 seconds, and they haven't been around long enough to know it is every 2 seconds. It's totally confusing to kids. And you can't start out reading something with a sense that I'm a better person simply because I talk a certain way for the last 2 seconds than this person, and I can't learn anything from them. You have to have a more humble approach to learning anything about the past. You can't start with, I'm better. They were racist and I'm better. Why? Because, well, I'm 18 and I noticed some people talk that way and I'm talking that way and that makes me a better person. No, it doesn't make you a better person. You are an ignorant person. We're trying to undo the ignorant part. And the only way to do that is, let me go back to ethnicity. A body of persons united by kinship, culture, and common traditions. The older people have to pass down the stuff to the younger people. If they cannot receive it, they will not receive it. And they will just have low attention spans. They will think they're better, kind of. I don't think deep down they really believe that, but I'll give you one more example, the word colored. There are some books that use the word colored. My students typically fidget, they use the term person of color. Well, grammatically, those are the same thing. What's the difference? Well, you ask anybody to explain it. Nobody can explain it. It's like fashion. It's like constantly trying to keep up with the new style. It's like they're rolling up their jeans in 7th grade and you're like, okay, I'm supposed to roll up my jeans. I have no idea why. And it's even worse in education because it shuts down progress. It kills curiosity. It creates an extremely low attention span. Why? Because if there is such a constant threat that you're a bad person because you used colored instead of person of color, if you can break that rule, how many other rules can you break? And you can't keep track of them, and you don't know who's in charge and who's the authority, and you just end up stop thinking. You just stop thinking, and it kills education. I say no more. No more. There was my wife and I were reading the same book. It's called Streams in the Desert. Great book. She was reading the newer version, which had been edited. I'm reading the original version. And sometimes the original version quotes black people, but they don't refer to them as black people. They refer to them as colored. But the whole point of the selection is that they're using the wisdom of this person who's called colored in a positive way, and that's there in the original. Well, that has been edited out and replaced with a different term, or just edited out completely, and you don't even know the person was black because it was just excised, cut out. For what reason? That's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about with ethnicity. If you're so afraid that using a certain term makes you a bad person, that's what makes you a bad person, well, then you're not going to have the confidence to move forward. And if you are confronted with original texts, you're going to stop reading because you're going to be judging the text in an inappropriate way, and you're not going to learn. You're not going to even see like obvious things that are there to be learned. And I get really fired up when I see students harmed, when I see their spirits crushed, when I see that they want to go to TikTok. They want to go to TikTok because what's the point? What seriously, it's all about being a good person. This means you follow whatever rules are there right now as best you can, and then you just try to keep up with that. That's basically corporate culture there too, in some ways, which is really frightening for me to see corporate culture like that. And I think that's going to be a task for us to wade through in the coming years. I'm hoping that we can make some progress on that. Let me finish by re-quoting Matthew here. Matthew 1:21. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. You can't save yourself from your sins. You can't make yourself a non-sinner. So there is an importance of mercy and grace that, however imperfectly, has been incorporated into our public law, with one example that we've talked about this week, the pardon power. Have a great Saturday. We'll talk to you soon.